The Grand Hall of the Galactic Coalition was filled with representatives from over 200 species. They sat in curved rows that rose toward a domed ceiling, made of living crystal. Light from 3 distant suns filtered through the transparent walls, casting rainbow shadows across the polished floor. This was the most powerful gathering in the known universe. Wars had been stopped. Here, empires had been formed and dissolved with a single vote. Today they had gathered to discuss a small blue planet called Earth. Commander Vorax walked slowly toward the central speaking platform. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Every eye, every sensor, every optical organ in the room turned to watch him. He was a Caldari, a species known throughout the galaxy for their warrior culture and their victories in countless conflicts. But Vorax did not look like a conqueror today. He looked like a survivor. His exoskeleton, once a beautiful shade of deep purple, was now marked with dozens of scars. White lines crisscrossed his chest and back where weapons had cut through his natural armor. His left arm ended at the elbow, a crude prosthetic attached where flesh and bone had once been. His eyes, once bright yellow, had faded to a dull amber. He moved like someone who had seen things that still haunted his sleep. The chamber whispered with curiosity. Vorax had requested this audience himself. He had used every favor he had earned in 60 years of military service just to stand here today. The coalition rarely listened to individual soldiers, no matter how decorated, but his message had been marked with the highest urgency. Code available. Vorax reached the platform and stood in the center. Holographic projectors activated around him, displaying his image to the thousands who could not see him directly. He took a deep breath through his breathing slits and began to speak. Honored members of the coalition, he said. His voice was rough, damaged by old injuries. I come before you today not as a commander, not as a representative of the Caldari Empire, but as a witness. I have seen something that the galaxy must understand before it is too late. He paused and looked around the chamber. He saw doubt on many faces, amusement on others. The Vorn delegation, seated in a place of honor near the front, seemed particularly entertained. Their Admiral Zethal was actually smiling with all 3 of his mouths. 17 years ago, Vorax continued, I led a battalion of 200 Caldari soldiers to a jungle world called KTH-7. Our mission was simple. A small vessel from an unknown species had crashed there. We were to capture the survivors and bring them back for study. The vessel's crew numbered only 12 individuals. He let that number hang in the air for a moment. 12, he repeated. My 200 soldiers against 12 survivors from a crashed ship. They had no heavy weapons, no armor, no support. They were scientists and security personnel, not warriors. The mission should have taken 1 day. Vorthox's voice grew quieter, and the chamber grew even more silent to hear him. 6 weeks later, reinforcements found me and 3 other survivors hiding in a cave. 196 Caldari soldiers were dead. The 12 humans were still alive. The word humans caused a ripple of reaction through the chamber. Most species here had heard of humanity, a young species from a small planet barely capable of interstellar travel, unremarkable in almost every way. Admiral Zethal stood up from his seat. Commander, you expect us to believe that 12 primitives killed nearly 200 Keldari warriors, perhaps your battalion was not as skilled as you claim. Vorax turned to face the Vaughn. Admiral, there was no anger in his eyes. Only a deep, tired sadness. Admiral, I have fought the Keldari's enemies for 60 years. I have faced the Silicon warriors of Theta 9. I have battled the minds of the collective. I have stood against every threat this galaxy has produced. Nothing in all my years of combat prepared me for humans. He touched a control on his prosthetic arm and a holographic image appeared. Above the platform, it showed a human female with brown hair and determined eyes. Her name appeared below, Dr. Nicole Harper, team leader of the crash survey vessel. This woman, Vorak said, was a scientist. Her specialty was studying plants. She had never killed anyone before. KTH-7, by the end of our encounter, she had personally eliminated 31 of my soldiers. Another image appeared, a human male with broad shoulders and a calm expression. Sam Brennan, security chief. This man taught the others how to fight, but more importantly, he taught them how to hunt. You see, honored members, humans come from a world they call Earth, and Earth is what we classify as a death world. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Death worlds were rare, planets where the gravity was crushing, the atmosphere was toxic, and every life form evolved to kill. On Earth, Vorthox continued. Humans were not the strongest creatures, they were not the fastest. They did not have claws or fangs or venom, but they became the dominant species anyway. Do you know how? He looked around the chamber, making sure everyone was listening. They became the greatest hunters their world had ever seen. They developed something called persistence hunting. When a human chooses prey, they do not stop. They cannot stop. They will chase their target for days if necessary, never resting, never giving up until the prey simply collapses from exhaustion. And then when their victim is helpless and broken, the human finally strikes. Admiral ZTHK laughed. You are describing animals, Commander. Primitive hunting techniques. We have weapons that can destroy cities. So did we, Vorthox replied quietly. We had orbital support. We had heavy plasma cannons. We had every advantage technology could provide, and still they killed us. Because humans do not fight the way we fight. They do not see war as a series of battles. They see it as a hunt. And once they mark you as prey, they will never ever stop coming. He turned to address the full chamber one last time. I have come here to warn you. The Vorn Dominion is gathering a fleet to invade Earth. I beg you, do not let this happen, not because I care about humans, but because I know what they will become. If you corner them, if you threaten their home, their families, their children, you will unleash something that this galaxy has never faced before. His voice rose with desperate intensity. Humans are apex predators. They are the monsters that other monsters fear. Do not challenge them. Do not threaten them. And for the sake of everything you hold dear, do not make them hunt you. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Admiral Zethal began to laugh, and soon other delegates joined him. The Vaughn had conquered 47 worlds. What were humans compared to that? Vorax lowered his head. He had tried. He had done everything he could. As he walked out of the chamber, he whispered a prayer for the souls of every soldier who would soon learn the truth about humanity. The warning had been given. The warning had been ignored, and somewhere in the darkness, of space, Vaughn warships were already moving toward Earth, the sky above Chicago burned orange and red as alien dropships descended through the atmosphere. They came in waves, hundreds of them blocking out the sun and casting shadows across the empty streets. Emergency sirens had been screaming for 3 hours straight. Most civilians had already fled to the underground shelters, but some had stayed behind. Sergeant Chris Palmer watched the invasion from the window of a ruined apartment building. He was 34 years old with short brown hair and eyes that had seen too much death already. Beside him crouched Corporal Megan Torres, her sniper rifle resting against the windowsill. She was calm, almost unnaturally so, her breathing slow and steady as she tracked the alien vessels through her scope. Behind them, Private Ben Carter checked his ammunition for the 5th time. He was barely 20, but war had aged him quickly. "How many do you count?" Chris asked quietly. Megan did not look away from her scope. "Too many, but they're landing in formation, organized." "Predictable," Chris smiled slightly. "Predictable is good." The firstborn soldiers hit the ground 3 blocks away. They were tall creatures, nearly 8 ft with gray skin and 4 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws. They wore black armor that seemed to absorb light, and they carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. They moved with absolute confidence, the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. That confidence would not last long. The Vaughn expected the humans to surrender. Their intelligence reports said that humans were a young species, barely capable of space travel, with primitive weapons and no experience in galactic warfare. Admiral Zethal had told his troops that the conquest would be finished in days. They would be home before the next cycle of their moons. The first sign that something was wrong came when a Vaughn patrol walked into a building that had been rigged with explosives. The blast killed 8 soldiers instantly. Before the survivors could react, gunfire erupted from 3 different directions. Human soldiers appeared from nowhere, firing with terrifying accuracy, then vanishing back into the ruins before the Vaughn could return fire. Lieutenant Katie Rivera led a squad of 12 through the subway tunnels beneath the city. They had been fighting for 6 hours straight, and they had not lost a single soldier. Katie was 28 years old with dark hair tied back and a fierce determination in her eyes. She had been a school teacher before the invasion. Now she was something else entirely. Her squad emerged behind a Vaughn position and opened fire. The aliens spun around, shocked by the attack from their rear. They had secured this area. They had checked every building. How had the humans gotten behind them? They did not understand that humans were born to hunt. They did not understand that humans had spent millions of years learning to track, to ambush, to kill. The Vaughn had technology. Humans had instinct. By nightfall, the Vaughn ground forces had suffered losses that Admiral Zekol could not explain. His tactical displays showed red markers everywhere, ambushes, traps, hit-and-run attacks that came without warning and ended before his forces could respond. The humans were not fighting a war. They were hunting. The reports that came back to his flagship were disturbing. Humans who had been shot multiple times continued fighting until their bodies physically gave out. One soldier, a man named Jake Morrison, had been wounded in both legs by plasma fire. He could not Walk could not stand, but he had crawled through 3 miles of burning streets, dragging himself through rubble and blood to deliver a communication device to the Resistance Command Center. He died with a smile on his face, knowing that his mission was complete. Megan Torres sat in her sniper nest and watched a Vaughn officer through her scope. He was directing his troops, pointing toward a building where human civilians were hiding. Megan exhaled slowly, steadied her heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger. The officer fell, his troops scattered in panic, not knowing where the shot had come from. She had killed 47 Vaughn soldiers today. She had not missed once. Admiral ZTH Cal demanded explanations from his commanders. How were primitives causing such damage? They had orbital superiority. They had better weapons. They had 300 warships in orbit. Why were ground casualties so high? His commanders had no answers. They only had fear. On the third day, a Vaughn battalion cornered Katie Rivera's squad in an abandoned factory. There was no escape. The aliens had blocked every exit and were closing in from all sides. By every military calculation, the humans should have surrendered. Katie looked at her soldiers. They were wounded, exhausted, low on ammunition. They knew they were going to die, and not one of them showed fear. Anyone want to surrender? She asked. The squad laughed. Actually laughed. Didn't think so, Katie said. She drew her combat knife. Then let's make them remember us. They charged directly into the Vaughn lines. 12 humans against 200 aliens. They should have been slaughtered in seconds. Instead, they fought for 45 minutes. They used their knives, their fists, their teeth. When their weapons ran out of ammunition, they picked up Vaughn weapons and kept fighting. When those weapons were destroyed, they fought with pieces of broken metal and chunks of concrete. Katie Rivera killed 19 Vaughn soldiers before she finally fell. Her last act was to pull the pin on a grenade and hold it against a Vaughn commander's chest. When reinforcements arrived, they found the factory filled with Vaughn bodies. The humans had lost 11 soldiers. The Vaughn had lost 137. Admiral Zethal read the report 3 times. He could not believe the numbers. He had seen species fight desperately before. He had seen courage and determination, but he had never seen anything like this. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not calculate acceptable losses or strategic withdrawals. When cornered, they did not surrender or flee. They attacked. They attacked with everything they had, with every ounce of strength in their bodies, with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere beyond reason. And the worst part, the part that kept Admiral Zethal awake in his quarters that night, was the look in their eyes. He had seen recordings from helmet cameras. He had watched humans fight and die, and in their eyes he had seen something that terrified him: joy. They were enjoying this, not the dying, not the suffering, but the fight itself, the challenge, the hunt. Somewhere deep in his memory, Admiral Zethal remembered a word from an ancient Vaughn legend, word for creatures that hunted not for food or territory, but for the pleasure of the kill. Apex predators. He pushed the thought away. They were just primitives. They would be defeated eventually. They had to be. But that night, for the first time in his long military career, Admiral Zethal locked his door and kept his weapon beside his bed just in case. The invasion continued, but something had changed. The Vaughn soldiers no Longer moved with confidence. They checked every shadow, every corner, every window. They jumped at sudden sounds they had come to Earth expecting. Easy conquest they had found there. Hunters instead. Commander Vorax sat alone in his quarters on a neutral space station, watching the battle reports from Earth scroll across his display screen. Numbers were exactly what he had predicted. Von casualties were climbing every hour. Human resistance was growing stronger, not weaker. Admiral Zethal's invasion was becoming a disaster. He felt no satisfaction in being proven right. He only felt old. Memories rising to the surface like bodies floating up from dark water. KTH 7. The jungle world, the place where he had learned what humans truly were. Vorax closed his eyes and let the memories take him back. He had been young then, barely 50 years old by Caldari counting, strong and confident, with an unbroken exoskeleton and 2 functioning arms. He had led a battalion of 200 warriors to a simple mission. Small vessel had crashed in the jungle. The crew needed to be captured for study. Nothing complicated. The humans had seemed so fragile when his scouts first spotted them. They had soft skin that broke easily. They had no claws, no natural armor, no venom. Their leader was a female named Nicole Harper, a scientist who studied plants. Her security chief, a male named Sam Brennan, carried a primitive projectile weapon that seemed almost laughable compared to Caldari plasma rifles. Vorax had given the order to surround the crash site and capture the survivors. He expected the mission to be over within the hour. Instead, his soldiers walked into a trap. The humans had spent 3 days preparing the area around their crashed ship. They had dug pits and covered them with leaves. They had bent young trees back and tied them with vines, creating spring traps that launched sharpened stakes. They had spread natural poisons from jungle plants on thorns and left them in the paths that Caldari patrols would take. 12 soldiers died before the Caldari even saw a single human. Vorax was shocked but not worried. He had nearly 200 warriors left. The humans could not hide forever. But the humans did not hide. They hunted. Nicole Harper led her small group through the jungle with a skill that seemed impossible. She knew which plants were safe to eat and which were deadly. She knew how to find water, how to build shelter, how to move without leaving tracks. Sam Brennan taught the others how to fight, not the formal combat that species learned in militaries, but something older, something primal. They attacked at night, when Caldari vision was weakest. Vorax later learned that humans had evolved on a world where they often hunted in darkness. Their eyes could adjust to low light. Their hearing could detect the slightest sound. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone could respond. The nights became terror. Vorax would post guards, and in the morning those guards would be found dead. No one heard the attacks. No one saw anything. The humans killed silently, using knives and grows in their bare hands. They left no evidence except bodies. One night, a young Caldari soldier named Vexarn was taken alive. The humans did not kill him. They released him 3 days later with a message carved into his exoskeleton. The message was simple: leave or die. Vorax refused to retreat. His pride would not allow it. He divided his forces and sent them to sweep the jungle sector by sector. The humans used this against him. They would let a patrol pass, then attack. From behind, they would make noise in one direction, draw attention, and strike from another. They set fires that spread through the dry underbrush, forcing Caldari soldiers into areas where more traps waited. After 3 weeks, Vorax had lost half his battalion. He called for orbital support. Warships in orbit burned large sections of jungle. With plasma bombardment, the fires raged for days, destroying everything in their path. Vorax was certain that no creature could survive such devastation, but they, humans, had hidden in a cave system that ran beneath the jungle floor. They emerged from the ashes like spirits, covered in soot and burns, but very much alive, and now they were angry. Sam Brennan led a night attack on Vorax's command post, 6 humans against 50 Caldari guards. By the time reinforcements arrived, 32 guards were dead, and the humans had stolen weapons, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Vorax finally understood what he was facing. These were not civilized beings fighting a defensive action. These were predators, apex predators like the great hunters that had once ruled his own world before his species killed them all. The humans were not trying to survive until rescue came. They were hunting his soldiers for practice. They were learning Caldari tactics, studying Caldari weaknesses, becoming more deadly with every encounter. During the 5th week, Vorax met Nicole Harper face to face. He had been separated from his patrol during a human ambush. Lost in the jungle, wounded in the leg, he stumbled into a clearing and found her waiting for him. She sat on a fallen log, eating fruit from a tree above her. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Her skin was covered in insect bites and scratches, but her eyes were calm, patient, the eyes of a hunter watching prey. You should have left, she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. We gave you a chance. Vorax raised his plasma rifle, but his wounded leg buckled and he fell. The weapon skidded away across the dirt. Nicole Harper did not move to attack. She just watched him struggle to reach his weapon. On my world, she said, there used to be great predators, lions, tigers, wolves. We killed most of them, not because we had to, because we could, because that's what we do. We're not the strongest or the fastest, we're just the most stubborn. We never stop hunting. She stood and walked toward him. Vorax expected death. Instead, she kicked his plasma rifle closer to him. Go home, she said. Tell your people what happened here. Tell them that Earth is not worth the cost. Then she walked into the jungle and disappeared. Vorax survived because Nicole Harper chose to let him live. When reinforcements arrived a week later, he and 3 other soldiers were all that remained of 200 warriors back on the space station. Vorax opened his eyes and looked at the battle reports from Earth. Colonel Greg Patterson and Major Amy Sullivan were organizing resistance cells across 3 continents. Human fighters were using the same tactics he had seen on KTH-7. Ambushes, night attacks, psychological warfare. The hunters had awakened. Admiral Zethal thought he was fighting a war. He did not understand that humans saw no difference between war and hunting. Every battle was a hunt. Every enemy was prey, and humans had been perfecting the art of hunting for millions of years before they ever looked up at the stars. Vorax watched a report showing human soldiers pursuing a retreating Vaughn unit. The aliens were faster, better armed, and had air support, but the humans kept coming. They followed tracks, anticipated movements, cut off escape routes. They chased the Vaughn for 3 days straight, taking turns sleeping while others continued the pursuit, never letting their prey rest. Finally, the Vaughn unit simply collapsed from exhaustion. The humans walked up to them and accepted their surrender without firing a single shot. Persistence. Hunting. The oldest human tactic, the one that had made them masters of their world. Vorax turned off his display and sat in the darkness of his quarters. He thought about Nicole Harper and her calm, patient eyes. He thought about Sam Brennan and the silent killings in the night. He thought about the message carved into Thex's exoskeleton: leave or die. The Vaughn had not listened. Now they would learn the same lesson that Vorax had learned in the jungles of KTH. 7. When you hunt humans, you are not the predator, you are the prey. 6 months after the invasion began, humanity stopped defending and started hunting. The change happened gradually. At first, human engineers like Dr. Kevin Walsh and Laura Chen had been studying captured Vaughn technology since the first weeks of the war. They took apart alien weapons, analyzed alien ship designs, and reverse-engineered alien power sources. Humans had always been good at taking ideas and making them better. Within months, they had combined Vaughn technology with human creativity to create something entirely new: the first human warship built with alien technology was named the Relentless. Admiral Nick Ray stood on her bridge and looked out at the stars with eyes that had seen too many friends die in the initial invasion. His executive officer, Commander Stephanie Grant, stood beside him with a data pad showing fleet positions. Behind them, dozens of crew members worked at their stations with focused determination. The Relentless was not beautiful. Human engineers had not wasted time on elegant designs. They had built a weapon, a hunter. The ship bristled with plasma cannons modified for human targeting systems. Her engines burned with power that Vaughn engineers said was impossible to achieve with their technology. Human scientists had simply refused to accept the limitations that the Vaughn believed existed. 40 human warships gathered in formation behind the Relentless. They were facing a Vorn armada of 120 vessels. The numbers said that humanity should retreat. The numbers said that this battle was already lost. The numbers did not account for what humans became when they were fighting for survival. Lieutenant Tony Vega sat in the cockpit of his fighter craft running final checks on his weapon systems. He was 26 years old with quick reflexes and absolutely no fear. Beside him in the formation flew Enan Heather Kim, who had been a test pilot before the invasion. Her scores in combat simulations had broken every record. Admiral Zethal commanded the Vaughn fleet from his flagship, the Conqueror. He watched the small human force approaching and felt confused. What were they doing? Did they really think they could win against such overwhelming numbers? He ordered his fleet to advance and destroy the humans. The battle that followed became legend. Throughout the galaxy, human pilots flew patterns that Vaughn targeting computers could not predict. They were not following any known combat doctrine. They were improvising, adapting, changing tactics every few seconds based on what they saw. Tony Vega dove straight toward the largest Vaughn warship, drew fire from dozens of Weapons then pulled away at the last moment while 3 human cruisers attacked from unexpected angles. Heather Kim flew her fighter into a gap in a Vaughn carrier shields and released her payload directly against the hull. She did not have time to escape the explosion. She ejected at the last possible second, her fighter consumed by fire, and was picked up by a rescue shuttle. 10 minutes later, she was back in a new fighter. Within the hour, the human warships took damage that should have been fatal, direct hits that should have destroyed them, but human crews were prepared. They had trained for exactly this situation. Damage control teams patched holes while the ship was still firing. Engineers rerouted power around destroyed systems. Medics treated wounded crew members who refused to leave their posts. 1 human destroyer, the Savage, lost half her crew to a plasma bombardment that burned through 3 decks. Her captain was dead. Her first officer was dead. Chief Petty Officer Dan Murphy took command and kept the ship fighting for another 2 hours until reinforcements arrived, when Admiral Zethau finally ordered damaged flagship to retreat. He had lost 63 warships. The humans had lost 8. The Vaughn admiral could not understand what had happened. His weapons were more powerful, his ships were more advanced, his crews were better trained. How had he lost? He did not understand that humans had spent their entire existence fighting against superior opponents. On Earth, they had faced predators with sharper teeth and stronger claws. They had survived ice ages and droughts and plagues. They had always been the underdog, and they had always won through creativity, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The war turned from that day forward. Human fleets began attacking Vaughn positions throughout the solar system. They did not fight like a species defending their home. They fought like hunters pursuing wounded prey. Master Sergeant Pete Dawson led boarding parties onto captured Vaughn ships. He was 42 years old, built like a tank with a shaved head and a smile that made enemies nervous. His teams moved through alien corridors with terrifying efficiency. They cleared rooms with grenades and gunfire, adapted to alien ship layouts within minutes, and showed no hesitation against enemies twice their size. During the assault on the Conqueror, Pete led his team through 6 decks of fighting before they reached the command center. The doors were locked and reinforced. Vaughn soldiers were making a final stand outside. Pete looked at his team. They were wounded, tired, low on ammunition. They had been fighting for 9 hours straight. Anyone need a break? He asked. His team laughed. They always laughed. They charged the final defense and broke through in less than 10 minutes. When Pete walked into the command center, he found Admiral Zethau cowering behind a console with 2 bodyguards. The bodyguards raised their weapons, but they were shaking too badly to aim properly. They had seen what humans could do. They had watched recordings of battles that defied everything they knew about warfare. Pete shot the weapons out of their hands and walked up to the admiral. The Vaughn leader was trembling. His 3 mouths were opening and closing without making any sound. Pete sat down across from him and smiled. It was not a friendly smile, you know. What's funny, Pete said. His voice was conversational, almost casual. Where I come from, we don't even consider this real war yet. We've been holding back, being careful, trying to minimize civilian casualties on both sides. He leaned closer. The admiral tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. What you've seen so far. This is just pest control if you really want to see what humans can do when they stop being nice. Keep fighting, I promise you won't enjoy it. Admiral Zekal surrendered his entire fleet that day. He handed over every ship, every soldier, every piece of military equipment the Vaughn had brought to Earth's solar system. He asked only one thing in return. Please, he said to Admiral Nick Reyes during the formal surrender ceremony. Please don't hunt us anymore, Nick. Reyes looked at the broken admiral for a long moment. He thought about the invasion, the burning cities, the millions of human civilians who had died in the initial attacks. Part of him wanted revenge. Part of him wanted to chase the Vaughn back to their home world and show them exactly what human fury looked like. But humans were more than just hunters. They were also capable of something that many species considered weakness. Mercy. Go home, Nick said quietly. Tell your people what happened here. Tell them that Earth is no longer available for conquest. Tell them that if anyone else comes looking for easy prey, they will find predators instead. The Vaughn fleet limped away from Earth, carrying survivors who would have nightmares for the rest of their lives. They would tell stories about humans to their children and their children's children, stories about creatures who smiled while they fought, creatures who refused to die, creatures who chased their enemies across the void of space with patient, hungry eyes, stories about apex predators. Back on Earth, celebrations erupted in cities that had been battlefields just months before. Humans cheered and cried and held each other. They had survived, they had won, but in quiet rooms and military bases around the world, commanders like Nick Reyes and soldiers like Pete Dawson were already planning the next phase. Earth was safe, but the galaxy was still dangerous. Other species might try what the Vaughn had attempted. Humanity needed to send a message. The hunt was not over, it was just beginning. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Coalition had never been so quiet. Representatives from over 200 species sat in their curved rows, staring at the central speaking platform with expressions ranging from fear to amazement to grudging respect. The war with Earth had changed everything. The Vaughn Dominion, once one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, had been humiliated by a species that most delegates had never heard of before. Now, that species was asking to join the coalition. Commander Vorax stood on the platform once again. His scars had not healed and his prosthetic arm still ached in cold weather, but his eyes were brighter than they had been the last time he spoke here. He had lived long enough to see his warning proven correct. More importantly, he had lived long enough to see what humans did after they won. They showed mercy. Beside Vorax stood the human delegation. Ambassador Gary Mitchell was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been a diplomat for 30 years, navigating difficult negotiations on Earth before the invasion. Next to him was Dr. Michelle Torres, humanity's chief diplomatic representative, a woman whose calm voice and patient smile had helped negotiate the Vaughn surrender. Behind them stood veterans of the war. Colonel Chris Palmer wore his dress uniform covered with medals. The sergeant who had defended Chicago was now one of humanity's most decorated soldiers. His eyes were harder than they had been before the war, but they still held warmth. Beside him stood Megan Torres, the legendary sniper, now major in charge of training new recruits. She stood perfectly still, watching the alien delegates with the same patient attention she once gave to targets. Delegation also included Pete Dawson, Nick Reyes, and dozens of other humans who had earned the galaxy's terrified respect. Vorthok stepped forward to speak. The chamber fell absolutely silent. 1 year ago, he said, I stood on this platform and warned you about humanity. I told you they were apex predators. I told you they would not be easy prey. I told you not to challenge them. He paused and looked around the chamber. Many delegates looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You did not listen. The Vaughn Dominion invaded Earth with 300 warships. They expected easy conquest. Instead, they found something that this galaxy has never encountered before. He gestured to the humans standing beside him. They found a species that refuses to surrender, species that fights harder when wounded, not weaker, a species that has spent its entire existence hunting creatures stronger and faster than themselves. And, most importantly, they found a species that chooses mercy when it could choose destruction. Whispers spread through the chamber. The Vaughn delegates, seated in a much smaller section than before, lowered their heads in shame. Their empire had collapsed after the failed invasion. Their military was broken, their reputation was destroyed, and the humans had let them live. I have studied humanity, Vorax continued. I have read their history. I have learned about their wars, their mistakes, their cruelty. They are not perfect. They have committed terrible acts against each other throughout their existence. But I have also learned about their capacity for forgiveness, their ability to turn enemies into friends, their strange belief that every being deserves a chance at redemption. He turned to face Ambassador Gary Mitchell. The Vaughn killed millions of human civilians during their invasion. They burned cities, they destroyed families, they committed acts that most species would consider unforgivable. Gary Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Yet when the war ended, Vorax said, humanity did not demand revenge. They did not pursue the Vaughn to their home world and destroy them. They accepted surrender. They treated prisoners with dignity. They even offered aid to worn soldiers who had been wounded fighting against them. He looked back at the assembly. This is what makes humanity truly terrifying. Not their skill in combat, not their determination, but their choice to be merciful when they have every reason to be cruel. They are apex predators who have chosen not to hunt unless threatened, and that choice makes them more dangerous than any species I have ever encountered. Ambassador Gary Mitchell stepped forward with a gentle smile. He moved slowly, deliberately, unthreatening, like a man who knew exactly how afraid the delegates were. My colleague makes us sound terrifying, Gary said. His voice was warm, almost friendly. And perhaps we did not ask for this war. We did not seek conflict with anyone. We were happy on our little blue planet, looking up at the stars and wondering what else was out there. He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. Now we know, and we want the galaxy to understand something important. We do not want to hunt you. We do not want to fight you. We want to trade with you, learn from you, share what we have learned with you. We believe that every species has something valuable to offer, and we are excited to Discover what those things are. His smile faded slightly and his eyes grew harder. But if you threaten our families, our home, or our friends, we will remind you why Earth's great. Predators went extinct, and we did not. We hunted them until there were no more left to hunt, and we are very, very good at hunting. Chamber was silent. No one moved. We offer friendship, Gary said softly. We offer partnership. We offer peace, but we also offer a promise. Cross us in. You will learn what our ancestors learned on the plains of Africa millions of years ago. You will learn why humans became the dominant species on a death world full of monsters. He paused. We outran them. We outsmarted them. We outlasted them. And when they were tired and weak and broken, we killed them, every single one. Dr. Michelle Torres stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Gary's arm. The ambassador relaxed slightly and stepped back. What my colleague means, Michelle said with a warm smile, is that we would very much like to be friends. Shall we vote? The Galactic Coalition voted unanimously to accept humanity as full members. Representatives who had laughed at Vorthax's warning now fell over themselves to welcome the humans. Trade agreements were proposed, cultural exchanges were suggested, several species immediately requested mutual defense treaties. No one mentioned challenging humanity again. No one even joked about it. In a quiet corner of the chamber, Vorax watched the celebrations. With a small smile, Colonel Chris Palmer approached him with 2 glasses in his hands. Commander, Chris said, I believe I owe you a drink. Vorax looked at the glass. It contained a brown liquid that smelled strong and sharp. What is this? He asked. Wysi. It's traditional after a war. Vorthax accepted the glass and took a small sip. The liquid burned his throat in a not entirely unpleasant way. I read reports of what you did on Karath 7, Chris said quietly, about Dr. Harper and her team, about how you survived. Vorax nodded slowly. She let me live, he said. She could have killed me, but she chose not to. I have wondered about that for 17 years. Chris smiled. That's the thing about humans, Commander. We're not just predators, we're also the species that domesticated wolves. We made friends with the very creatures that once hunted us. We believe in second chances. He raised his glass to second chances. Vorthax raised his own glass to apex predators. He said, may the galaxy never forget. They drank together while the celebration continued around them. Later that night, Vorax stood alone on an observation deck, watching Earth's blue marbles spinning in the darkness of space. It looked so peaceful from here, so harmless, just another ball of rock and water orbiting an ordinary star. But Vorax knew better. He knew what lived on that little blue world. He knew what would happen to any species foolish enough to threaten it. The galaxy had learned its lesson today. Humanity had joined the community of stars, not as conquerors but as partners. They would trade and cooperate and contribute to the greater good, but in dark corners and quiet rooms throughout the galaxy, leaders would remember what humans could become if pushed. They would remember the stories from the Vaughn War. They would remember the soldiers who smiled while they fought, and the civilians who picked up weapons and became warriors overnight. They would remember that humans were apex predators who had simply chosen not to hunt, and they would be very, very careful never to give them a reason to change their minds, Vorox finished his whiskey and turned away from the viewport. The war was over. A new era had begun. And somewhere out there in the vast darkness of space, 200 species were learning the same lesson that he had learned on KTH-7. Never challenge a human, never threaten what they love, and never ever forget what they are capable of. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place.